welcome to the summit. For anybody that doesn't know you, could you just tell us a bit more about your story and your background and how you got into the work that you're currently doing?
Yeah, I actually started my professional career as a clergyman, a priest in the Church of England, and that followed on from a physics degree. So already there was kind of physics and theology in the mix. The early work didn't work out for one reason or another. I sort of had a big religious crisis, if you like, as well as a personal crisis, and so left the church when I was still around in my 30s, perhaps early 30s, and then did a PhD on philosophy. And the significance of that was it got me into Plato, and that was the beginning of a substantial turning point, because I realized that working on yourself is absolutely crucial to finding meaning in life. It's very different from the scientific paradigm, which just suggests that you can kind of find objective meaning and it doesn't really matter who you are so long as you can understand it. Whereas Plato and the early philosophers all stressed that your capacity to resonate with the world is absolutely fundamental. And so from that, I ended up doing psychotherapy, because it felt like psychotherapy was actually much more akin to ancient philosophy than modern philosophy. You know, modern philosophy sort of models itself on science and so misses out this fundamental part. So I, had my own psychotherapy, which was very, very important to me, helped settle things down at last, and also became a psychotherapist, and hence, writing and reading about all these things as well.
Fantastic. Now, I've heard Jung say, and I might be getting the quote wrong here, but he said something like, psychotherapy became popular and actually, it had a massive growth in popularity alongside the decline of religion in the West. Is that fair to say? And why do you think that might be?
Yeah, he made this observation that as the churches across Europe were emptying, so the psychotherapists' consulting rooms seemed to be filling up. He thought this was particularly so in Protestant countries, interestingly, because in Catholic countries, although people may not go to church so much, Catholicism, with its rituals, its saints, its pattern of life, its mythology, still widely pervades the culture. And broadly speaking, he thought that psychotherapy has arisen because, certainly in Protestant Europe, we've lost the wisdom to deal with inner life. We've majored very much on the development of science and technology, which of course has its own benefits, but it's been to the detriment of our inner lives. And so psychotherapy has kind of rushed in to fill the vacuum. And its ideas, have become quite pervasive in culture as well. Everyone speaks about the unconscious, everyone speaks about having an ego. These are relatively recent ways of putting things. And in some ways, they are a kind of ersatz spirituality that's become a common currency as we struggle with this side of our lives.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And in recent years, we've seen a massive resurgence in the popularity of Jung. And why do you think that might be?
Well, he himself said that if the 20th century was Freud's century, then maybe his time would come. Freud was always very, very keen to align his work insofar as he could with the dictums of science. And, scientific materialism's great heyday was really through the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century. Now, Freud investigated all sorts of other things, which, of course, a lot of the scientifically minded would vehemently reject. But nonetheless, he wanted to bow to the authority of science. Now, Jung, he wasn't not scientific. In fact, in some ways, he was much more so than Freud. He spent the first decade of his life as a psychologist working in a clinic where, for example, schizophrenia was first diagnosed. And he did a lot of experimental work, word association tests and so on. So it wasn't that he was averse to an evidence base, but he always realized the limits, I think, of science. And that particularly when it comes to the workings of the psyche, that inevitably takes us beyond what science can investigate through the scientific method. you know, things like dreams and so on. You can't investigate the meaning of dreams in a laboratory. You can perhaps investigate the fact that people do have dreams, and that they might be meaningful, but quite what the meaning is another question entirely. So I think that now that we're feeling a bit freer from a strict scientific materialism, Jung's time might come, and he feels a lot more of now. I mean, there's some very basic things as well, which Jung first suggested, that have become the norm in psychotherapy. So, for example, Freud thought you couldn't really treat anyone over about the age of 35, because by the time you reach that age, things were already too set. Whereas Jung was always interested in people of all ages. And of course, now psychotherapy is interested in people of all ages. Freud thought that you need to have this strict regime of many times a week lying on the couch psychotherapy, whereas Jung always experimented with sitting up, with telling people to, you know, go and have a few dreams for a few months and then come back again. And that mode, that way of working is much more, you know, feels much more now too. So maybe this century will become much more the Jung century.
100%. So now I want to get into some of the key ideas of Jungian psychology. But before we do, I'd be curious to ask you, Mark, what do you think Jung's most important contribution to our understanding of human nature has been? If you had to pick one thing.
Yeah, I mean, that's fascinating. You could suggest lots of things. I mean, something that in a way is quite obvious, but that comes to mind, is that Jung was quite clear that what we need to take the next step in life is already right in front of us, if only we know how to pay attention to it. You know, we're very inclined in the modern world to have ideals that imagine how we want to be in 30 years' time, or conversely, you know, we can get very preoccupied with the past and rather stuck in the past and what did and didn't happen. And Jung was very clear that what we need is actually present right now. And that's really important, because to make any kind of change, the important thing is the next step you take. It's not where you might end up. So he very much stressed that. I mean, he wasn't alone in saying that. That's quite a norm in, say, spiritual traditions. But it does require trusting that meaning is in the right here, right now. You know, meaning is to be found right now, today. And we're not so good at that in the modern world, because we tend to think there might be just meaningless contingencies all around us, and that we somehow have to inject meaning into our lives rather than discerning the meaning in our lives. So that was a really important point, I think. You know, so if you go into psychotherapy, you might spend quite a lot of time at first trying to articulate your dreams, go over what happened in the past. But eventually a point comes where you realize that what actually happened, maybe even that morning on the way to the therapy room, has got something really significant to tell you about the step you might take after you leave the therapy room. And that is real change, because it's happening here and now. It's not just mulling over things. So that was one thing. He was also very, very clear that the psyche is active. He thought that a key dynamic actually is that we try to constantly return to a kind of balance. He called it homeostasis. But that is just the flip side of saying that the psyche is always on the move. So for example, he thought actually we probably are dreaming all the time. It's just that during the day, we don't notice, because our waking consciousness, a bit like the sun blots out the stars, so our waking consciousness blots out our dreaming. But the point there is, again, that, you know, we're constantly on the move internally. And that's good, because there's always energy, there's always dynamism to be tapped into. The question is how you kind of navigate and work with that energy. So that was a key idea of his psychology as well. You know, so he doesn't see us, for example, as static robots that somehow need to download a new source code. You know, if only we could sort of reprogram ourselves. That way of thinking is completely averse to him. We're living intelligences, and again, you know, feeling yourself to be like that is itself hugely liberating. And then a third idea is that he thought that myths really matter, and these kind of stories archetypal stories, to use his, well-known word, they're really important. And again, I think they're crucial because the point about myths is that they help illuminate what otherwise might seem quite a trivial detail. How you respond to someone, for example, whether you respond openly, or whether you respond bitterly, or whether you respond kind of kindly. Those little moments, they might seem sort of inconsequential. What does that matter? Except, you just start to read myths, and immediately you see that, for example, there might be a myth of someone who was speaking to someone they encountered who they thought was just another human being, and it turned out they were an angel, and that angel had huge power to bless or curse them. That story illuminates why every moment might count, because in its mythological language it says, don't presume to know what's going on. Again, seize every moment. The big myth that he's associated with after Joseph Campbell is the myth of the hero's journey, which is another story that tells how it's really important to go on the journey, not just, as it were, to look for souvenirs from life, but to go on the journey that discovers the real treasure, and that costs. So that's a myth that tells us that this life is going to be one of suffering and struggle, but that is not in itself bad. Again, I think that a lot of modern psychology is very inclined to think that what's a struggle, what's suffering is somehow bad, and we need to shift to ways of being happier, for example, and try and get rid of the downside of life. Jung would say that's completely mistaken, and myths can help us live with struggle and suffering because they give it a much bigger context, and open us to real transformation, not just kind of constantly trying to tweak our lives to sort of nudge them in what we think is a better direction.
Yeah, no, those are three powerful insights. And then you touched on it briefly there. But this whole Jung's idea of the archetypes, for anybody that hasn't heard of this concept before, how would you provide a simple explanation of how to understand the archetypes?
Yeah, he thought that, he was very influenced by Darwin and evolutionary ideas. And he thought that much as, I don't know, we've got 5 fingers because we've inherited the 5 proto fingers, you might say, that you find in fish fins, for example. So there's a kind of backstory to our physiological presence. And so too, he thought there's a deep backstory to our psychological presence, and that what we're born with is inherited as much as we then try and do things with it in our lives. And archetypes are the kind of inherited features or structure or dynamisms of our psyche. If we've got 5 fingers because fish have 5 bones in their fins, so for example, we might have an archetype of the maternal figure in our minds, not just because we all have mothers, but because having a mother is a deep truth about being a human being that goes back across generations. So how we experience the maternal will be shaped, in some significant measure by that past as much as by our direct experience. And the way he put that was saying, therefore, there's an archetype of the mother. There may be actually several archetypes of the mother. There may be like the good mother and the bad mother, to put it a bit simply, and fathers, of course, too. But realizing that you have these kind of patterning influences in your mind that you might be relating to quite as much as what's happening immediately in front of you, again, can be really illuminating and help you to become a bit freer in life as well.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I think you said this in your course with us in February, that the same way that birds come born with the program or the knowledge to build a nest, in the same way we come with these archetypes. And one of our other speakers, Dr. Kevin Liu, he describes an archetype like a jug, and that's like kind of the structure, the container for for that particular pattern of behavior, and what form the behavior takes depends on the cultural context. So it might be expressed one way in one culture and another way in another culture, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. Again, I mean, these are all metaphors, but I always resist the slightly mechanical metaphors, like say programs, because programming in a computer strictly determines what the computer does. It's an absolute tight chain of cause and effect. Whereas archetypes are much more like living ideas. They're like stories, and the story can be retold and is pliable, and in a way needs to be retold in order to keep it alive. If it's just written down and then left, then it loses its energy. So archetypes are these living qualities. But yeah, that's broadly right. And what we do with them, the form that we in our individual lives make of them, is the crucial thing.
Mm. I'm curious, you're a psychotherapist, and this might be a stupid question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Is it possible for somebody to be possessed by an archetype, like to be possessed by like the hero archetype, for example, where they overly identify with this this form of behavior or this energy? Is that a possibility for people?
No, for sure. I mean, the psychological word is identify, where you lose your sense of yourself and instead think that you're the Messiah, you're the hero, whatever it might be. And that inevitably comes unstuck because you're living ultimately a false life. And probably what will happen is that because you can't be the perfect hero or the perfect Messiah yourself, you'll try to force people around you to treat you in that way. So you might try and establish yourself as a cult leader, for example, so that you have the world around you telling you are this Messiah that you think you are. But of course that abuses people and probably comes unstuck sooner or later. So over-identifying. Another key Jungian word is inflation, how the ego can become inflated because it thinks it's semi-divine. And instead, you've got to recognize your relation in the kind of spiritual ecology, if you like. We have a crucial role to play as human beings, and must learn that rather than thinking we're something else.
100%. Now, you said there, we've got a crucial role to play as human beings here. What did Jung see as the purpose of a human life? Why did he think we were here, and what were we up to?
Yeah, I think that he thought, drawing a lot on 19th century philosophy and psychology, and he was very influenced by figures like Nietzsche and so on, that the task of the human being is to make an individual life, to thrive as a particular manifestation of soul, of spirit, of life, of humanity. So the individual really matters for Jung. I mean, Nietzsche had made this remark that one thing is necessary, and you think, oh my goodness, what's the one thing that's necessary? And he says to give style to your character. And I think what Nietzsche means by that is to become your own person, to be open, to be capable of transmitting and channeling and being translucent to all sorts of dynamics in life, but nonetheless to do it in your own particular way. And you see this with any individual that you admire. I don't know, someone that everyone will know of is the Dalai Lama. Very many people will think that the Dalai Lama is channeling a whole lot, but he's also very distinctively an individual person, with his laugh and his look and his cheekiness and all the rest of it. And for Jung, it's the individual that that brings the universal into being, if you like, rather than feeling you've got to somehow be some sort of general human being that's perfect in every respect. That is a disastrous way to go. It actually ends up emptying yourself out and leads to all sorts of troubles like identification and inflation. So the purpose of life is to become individuated. I mean, you already said that word. That's one of the things he meant by this notion of individuation. It's to bring together all that has happened to you in its particularity and make something of it. He famously remarks at one point, the task in life is not to be perfect, it's to be complete. And I think what he meant by that is that to gather all that's happened and knit it into some sort of a whole, so that everything is operative, everything is valued, everything is related to, and nothing is kind of cut off or split away.
No, that's really interesting. Again, something you mentioned back in February was about Jung's view of enlightenment. Could you maybe expand on that a bit? What did Jung think about enlightenment?
Well, I think quite, if you just look at the word, I think he thinks bringing everything, so insofar as possible, to conscious light. So making everything conscious. I mean, this touches a bit on one of his key ideas, which is the notion of the shadow. And the shadow is a metaphor. When you're out in the sunshine, you have a shadow that follows you around, that's just behind you, that looks shadowy, but somehow has a sort of vitality and life. And he thought that we have shadows in our psyche, which similarly, are absolutely glued to us. They somehow come from us, but we can't quite see what they are, and it's hard to relate to them. But bringing that to light, bringing that to conscious light, is a key part of what it is to be enlightened. And he thought that when you can bring what is otherwise in darkness and closest to you to light, so your own personality, your own vicissitudes, your own likes and dislikes, your own fears as well as loves, when you can become more and more conscious of that, at the same time you start to see that there's more reaching to further horizons as well. A bit like the sun will light up the whole landscape when it rises, and not just what's immediately around you. And whilst you may see what's further away less clearly, you're certainly more and more aware that it's there. So enlightenment also includes the sense of becoming more and more aware of dynamics, lives, energies, and so on, that reach out far, far beyond you, but that you nonetheless can learn how to relate to. That too would be a key part of enlightenment for him.
For sure. Now, you mentioned the shadow there. How would, in Jungian therapy or Jungian analysis, how would the analyst go about helping the person start integrating their shadow? Like, what would the process for that actually look like in practical terms?
Well, a really key way of getting to know your shadow is attending to your likes and dislikes, particularly in other people. So if you find yourself falling in love with someone, then because you don't actually know that person yet, it can happen in an instant. Probably what's happening is that that person has triggered something inside you that you already love, and you've projected that out onto this person, and so think you love that person. And similarly, if you meet someone and instantly take a dislike to them, which happens all the time, you don't know that person. So what's probably happened is that person has triggered a part of you that you dislike, and you've seen it in them and so dislike them. Now, particularly when it comes to dislikes, but also to likes, when they have this quality of sort of overwhelming you or completely shaping your experience for good or ill, you're probably dealing with your shadow. And the thing to do is to ask yourself, look, wait a minute, I've only just met this person. How come I have these overwhelming feelings towards them? What does it remind me of myself? Can I make some sense of that? And the chances are it can be quite difficult, can take quite a long time, because the psyche is very powerful, and particularly these dynamics for periods can be quite overwhelming. But sooner or later they kind of quieten down, and then it's a good idea to ask yourself, why did I fall for that person? Why did I so hate that person? Why was I envious of another person? And that will tell you something about yourself, which is active and dynamic in yourself, but in the shadow, beginning to bring it to light.
Interesting. So if just by bringing it to light, just by being aware of it, by making it conscious, then you're less, what are the benefits of doing that? Are you less affected by it? How will people benefit by doing that?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, in some ways, it's all quite simple. The aim is to bring things to consciousness, to notice things. But consciousness is not just this sort of static, passive thing that we do. it's always reflexive, always interactive, always relating, it is alive. And so much like, you know, when someone walks into the room, you relate to them. Even to ignore them, it's to relate to them, and they'll feel you ignoring them. So too, with what's going on in our psyches, to relate to them changes things. It incorporates, it welcomes, it befriends, or it rejects, hates, loathes. And so noticing is never mere noticing in the psyche. It's not like making a scientific observation that can pretend at least it doesn't change the situation at all. You know, observing, being observed, the observer, what's observed, they're always entangled. The trick is to become more skillful in your observation, and particularly to learn that often it's what seems subtle and inconsequential that actually turns out to be the most powerful and consequential. So the amplification of what you notice is really a key thing for Jung and for all psychotherapy, actually.
So we've touched on a few of them already, but what would you say the key ideas in Jungian psychology that we haven't covered yet that people should be aware of going forward?
Yeah, well, quite a good one, if you're thinking about how to change your life, is a midlife crisis. This is an idea that originates with Jung, and he makes this observation that we know that we're mortal, and so the first half of our life is going to be felt very differently from the second half of our life. And he made the observation that it's a bit like the morning, where you know the sun is still rising in the sky, and as it were, the day feels full of potential. Whereas when you start to notice that the sun has passed the zenith and is beginning to set, you know that the day is coming to an end, and so it has a very, very different feel that time of day. You won't, as it were, launch out on new projects. You might try and consolidate what's happened during the day or give thanks for it. And so similarly, he thought that our lives are like kind of single days, and that at various points you become particularly aware that you've been given a life, and so you want to make something of that life. And that might be a moment where you try and find a relationship, or you try and find work that's meaningful, or you try and establish yourself in a particular place by buying a house, or whatever it might be. These kind of activities that are appropriate to that moment because they're trying to give you a place in the world. But there also comes another moment where you realize that you can't just keep on doing that indefinitely, that life is limited. And so the question then becomes much more, so what is the meaning of all this? You know, what's all this activity been about? What can I kind of make sense of? Maybe what can I pass on, transmit? Where am I going next? Am I preparing for that now, for the next day? So thinking about the midlife crisis, which needn't happen, at the age of 35 or 40 or 45, it might happen at different moments. You might launch out into a career, and then halfway through the career, start to wonder what that career is really about. So there's a kind of midlife crisis in your career. It can happen in different ways. But nonetheless, the basic principle is there's a sort of time for everything. If you start asking yourself, what do I think I'm doing in life? And it feels like a crisis. Well, there might be something quite good about that, because maybe it is saying to you, it's time to consolidate, to assess, rather than try and establish and build. So the midlife crisis is a really, again, quite simple idea in a way, but can profoundly shape how you approach where you find yourself to be, what sense you try and make of it. Another one that he majored on, in common with psychotherapy, are dreams. I already mentioned that he wondered whether actually we're dreaming all the time. It's just that during the daytime we don't notice. But certainly he thought that dreams aren't just kind of background noise in our brains, but that the images that our psyches conjure and that we notice during the night, they have meaning, they're telling us something. So a very typical thing that might happen, for example, is that someone you saw during the day, you dream of at night, because of this projection mechanism, that somehow they reminded you of, say, an aspect of your shadow. So you have a dream of them during the night where they turn into a monster, or they befriend you, or something happens in your encounter with them. Now, you're not really dreaming about that person, you're dreaming about that aspect of your own psyche that you saw reflected in that person. So dreams can be really useful because they illuminate part of this other aspect of yourself. And I quite often think of them as just sort of images, a bit like, you know, suddenly you become a great artist that can make short films or, you know, draw pictures. You know, the psyche is an amazing thing, really. And that holding on to those images by making a note of them or telling someone else about them, very immediately you start to notice all sorts of things about yourself, you know, much like looking at a work of art, you notice all sorts of things about life. And this happens, you know, every night. If you don't have dreams, then you can normally start remembering dreams quite easily just by saying, I'm going to write down any dreams I remember. And very commonly people start remembering dreams. This is the kind of the gift of the psyche, if you like, which is throwing up every day and night, and can be really valuable for this expansive work that Jung got on about. So there's a couple of ideas. I mean, there are lots of others. Maybe just to throw in one that's a bit more subtle, but was actually crucial for Jung. He was very interested in tension in the psyche and the meaning, say, of struggle and suffering. And he thought that this is the kind of growth point for us as individuals, and, you know, maybe collectively for a society as well, to try and make something of the struggles, not just to ameliorate them and try and reduce them, but to try and understand them. And he thought that it happens by what he called the transcendent function. And broadly, the idea is that, you know, if someone comes to you for therapy, they've probably got themselves and their problem that they're wrestling with, that they can't resolve. And one way of approaching that would be a more behavioral approach, to try and say, well, if you try this, maybe it eases the tension, maybe it makes it a bit better. And sometimes that's very valuable because, you know, problems can really hinder people in life. So you have to ease the tension a bit. But Jung would also say there's something in the tension that's trying to be shown or communicated to you. And if you can tolerate the tension, you and this other thing, then in time, a kind of third position or a transcendent position, a position, by that he just meant that a sense of things that transcends the immediate situation, that will start to show itself. And that, he thought, was the real way to grow. You know, so for example, you know, you're in a relationship, you have this repeat argument with your partner about something or other. And you try all sorts of ways to talk more cordially, you know, to, you know, I don't know, find other things to do together so this doesn't constantly throw itself up. You know, and there may be some value in that. But you might also ask yourself, you know, why does this tension keep showing itself up? You know, and then you realize that actually your partner reminds you of your sibling who you always hated and who bullied you or something like that in life. And that's a third position. A new element comes into the room, the memory of the sibling. And by then identifying that that is where the problem lies, maybe a whole new dynamic becomes possible with your partner. And you grow as well because you've understood something about yourself, you've incorporated it, included it. You know, maybe you're able to, either in your mind's eye or actually literally, befriend and heal what happened with your sibling. And so life expands. So that sense of holding on to the tension insofar as possible, not masochistically, but insofar as is possible. Often these tensions in life are trying to reveal something or show something to us. So that's a crucial part, he thought, of real growth as well, and not just trying to sort of get on with life as you've always known it.
No, that's really interesting. I've never heard that one before. But going back to dreams, so you mentioned, you know, just by having the intention of writing down your dreams, you're going to have more memorable dreams in that. In Jungian therapy, how would someone work with their therapist to start understanding their dreams and then using that information to improve their day-to-day life? Like, how would they, I don't want to say interpret, but how do they work with the symbols that are presented to them in their dreams to better understand themselves, if that makes sense?
No, it does. And the quick answer is that Jung thought, insofar as is possible, don't interpret dreams, but actually extends the dream And his phrase for this was active imagination. And so the more Jungian therapists, for example, if a client brings a dream, they'll try and create a mood in the therapy room that allows the dream almost to come back to life. And then you can start asking the client questions like, you know, there was a crowd over there. Did you know who was in the crowd? You know, what time of day was it? Or how old were you? Just try and amplify what's going on in the dream, and then say, you know, can you tell what happened next? Or in your mind now, what happens if you go up to that person in the dream? Do you say anything? Do they say anything back to you? So you kind of try and continue the dream in waking consciousness by sort of just slipping into a slightly different state of consciousness where the dream can sort of rise a bit to the surface, but your waking mind can interact with it a bit. And the point for Jung about doing that is that you're working directly with what's unconscious then. You're allowing it to unfold, to you know, run with its own energy, run with this dynamism. Now, at some point, you might interpret the dream. You might say, oh, well, that reminds me of this, or that reminds me of that. But you don't do that too soon, because you curtail this natural unfolding in the dream. It's a bit like a story. You know, someone wrote a story and wrote the first chapter and then said, by the way, you know, that first chapter was all about the great difficulties that human beings have with animals. You think, oh, well, I can see that, but I want the story. You know, the story is where the kind of actions is at. And so, you know, treating the narratives of our lives as a kind of language that has its own wisdom. And if we can follow, again, it's a bit like the myths, you know, if we can follow the narrative, then that might actually be far more expansive than too quickly sort of trying to grab the meaning of this or understand the meaning of that. That's more the kind of ego function, trying to keep control or keep power of things. But learning to relate to that which is going on inside ourselves and the world around us can actually be much more productive at the end of the day.
Really interesting. So what are some other techniques that Jungians would use to help people make changes in their lives?
Yeah, so this active imagination can be extended in all sorts of ways, not just amplifying dreams, but I know art therapies, for example, which might encourage you to draw or to play with sand, all sorts of things like that. Again, they're trying to find ways where you can explore this semi-conscious state of mind, which has this huge influence and power. So they're really important ways in which Jung's ideas have been extended. He thought that places are really important too. He thought that places always have a kind of charge or presence that may give us something or may stir something up in us. So for example, you know, going on walks or going on pilgrimages or visiting different places, making your place, you know, moving the pictures around your room, all sorts of little things that you can do like that, and asking yourself, you know, how does that change things for me? That too, again, in this kind of very interactive, dynamic sense of life that he had. And he had a lot of money. He married a very, very wealthy woman and actually built a whole castle. And so, you know, heavily invested in a place for himself in order to amplify his own unconscious life. Now, you know, most of us can't afford to do that. If we do, we probably go a bit mad because you need to keep a bit of a check on your fantasies. But nonetheless, we have a lot more scope perhaps for experimenting with these things than we might realize. You know, go around a museum and don't just learn about the past, but ask yourself, what does this object conjure up in me now as I look at it? And then look at another object and feel how different it is. These are all ways of amplifying the psyche. Another area that Jung's got quite well known for, which I think is really fascinating and is worth paying a lot of attention to, are the synchronicities of life that start to occur. Now, these are the meaningful coincidences that, again, once you start to notice them, you realize they start to happen all the time. Now, people have various ideas about how synchronicities work, and that can be speculated upon almost endlessly. Jung himself had this very interesting dialogue with one of the founders of quantum physics, and I'm going to say Wolfgang Pauli, but I might be wrong about that. I quite often get this name wrong. But nonetheless, there was a very significant figure in early quantum physics who was a very troubled man and came to Jung for therapy. And then they talked a lot about the new physics and the new psychology. So people speculate about that an awful lot. I mean, just in parenthesis, my sense actually is that physicists like Heisenberg, like David Bohm and so on, they reached for spiritual or psychological perceptions to understand this new physics, because they couldn't really understand the meaning of the new physics, even though it was very powerful in terms of making predictions, rather than quantum physics suddenly proving the whole of spiritual traditions, which is often the way it's talked about now. I think it was actually the other way around. But anyway, that aside, synchronicities, meaningful coincidences, certainly happen. And however you explain them happening. And paying attention to them can be really valuable, because they're just like little nudges or encouragements, or, you know, sometimes they become much, much more meaningful. They release whole surges of energy that enable you to do something. You know, sometimes novelists will tell you stories about how they had an encounter in the coffee shop and suddenly a whole story started to unfold before their eyes. So, you know, big or small, synchronicities are really worth taking note of. You know, at the very least, it's nice because it tells you that life is active, life is dynamic, it's worth living, which is such a problem that many people face today.
Fascinating, fascinating. So in terms of these synchronicities in your own life, did you notice any around the times that you were making like big changes into psychotherapy or anything? Did anything show up for you?
Yeah, I noticed synchronicities more in quite seemingly random ways, actually. I don't know, one that I remember, it's stuck in my mind. I mean, I go through phases of, sometimes I keep synchronicity diaries and try and make a note of them. Again, because a bit like dreams, this enables you to see more and more. I'm not doing that at the minute, but the last time I kept a synchronicity diary, I remember one quite striking one, which was seemingly meaningless. I don't know quite what it meant, but it was striking. Was I'd just been to a talk about jinns, which are these kind of trickster spirits, particularly in Islamic culture. As I left the talk and stepped onto the street, a motorbike with a big carrier on the back saying jinns sort of sped by, you know, and then I looked it up and there's no delivery company called Jinns. So I don't know quite, you know, there might well be another company called Jinns, but certainly not a delivery company. You know, I thought, oh, and I just thought, oh, well, you know, I should pay attention to what I've just heard, not just forget it. And it has helped it stick in my mind. So that, you know, that sometimes, often for me, they're just quite trivial. You know, when I look back to the big changes in my life, they were, in a way, they were born much more of collapse than illumination. So, you know, maybe I just wasn't really aware of the synchronicities at the time, and could learn to pay more attention to that going forward.
Mm-hmm. So Mark, before you go, just a couple of questions. Have you got any sort of key takeaways or concluding points you'd like to make that you think people should take with them from this interview?
Yeah, well, one is maybe a more personal point, that I think these things take time as well. You know, if it's true that our task in life is to become individuated, to give style to our character, to become a particular incarnation or manifestation of this tremendous thing called life, then that's going to take all your life. And again, quite a ultimately destructive notion, I think, that does the rounds in psychology quite a lot, is that you can do the 8-week program or have the quick idea and that will change everything. Suddenly you'll be manifest and realized. Well, no, I mean, Jung said this is a lifelong undertaking, which is good because it actually gives meaning to the whole of your life, rather than just thinking, you know, I just need to find that bit of wisdom or implement that idea and suddenly everything will be fine. You know, sometimes things do change quite fast. I'm not saying they can't change quite fast at times, but mostly I think it's worth thinking about how the present moment, what's happening here and now, is part of a much bigger picture, much bigger story, and to enjoy the present moment in the confidence that it's part of this bigger story. That is quite a good thing. And then, you know, that then I think applies to the times we live in, that it feels like we're living through a time of crisis. You know, it's your, you know, the crisis of choice is yours, whether it be climate change, whether it be political trouble. You know, we're speaking at the end, or what might be the end, who knows, of the COVID crisis, who knows how long it's going to go on for. But crises have meaning for Jung and for others, but certainly for Jung. They're not meaningless, they're not just incidental. You know, maybe by tolerating the struggle that crises precipitate, we learn new things that we just wouldn't have anticipated in any other way. Because when we're not in crisis, we're very inclined just to stick with what we know. But a crisis can force us onto that which we've ignored, or that which we haven't seen or forgotten. You know, as long as it doesn't break us, of course. So we need to be kind to ourselves as well. Don't be masochistic about these things. But there's a sort of different side to the sense of crisis in the modern world, which I think is that it could presage the birth of a new sense of things. You know, whether it be actually in this world, or whether it be in whatever happens next, or other aspects, other dimensions of our being that are trying to speak down to us, you might say, in the present moment, and that because we live in a secular age, we've rather forgotten. You know, so crises can be born, and they can give birth to new things. So maybe that's a sort of hopeful word for an otherwise quite troubled time.
Definitely, definitely. Now, are there any books or any resources you'd recommend for someone looking for an introduction to the key ideas of Jung?
Yeah, well, Jung, he wrote an awful lot, and some of his writing is very difficult, a bit impenetrable. But he also gave talks, and the collections of his talks and lectures, I mean, one is published as Modern Man in Search of Soul. And if you'll forgive the gendered language of the early 20th century, it's got a good sense of, it can give you a good sense of his psychology. He wrote an autobiographical work too, Memories, Dreams and Reflections. And it's a really good read. It's quite a puzzling read at times, but nonetheless, it's very gripping, and maybe will precipitate all sorts of thoughts. There are some good introductions to Jung's thoughts. Again, probably the best thing to do is to look online, or when you can, go to a bookshop and pick one that strikes you as interesting, because sometimes people write about Jung in a more clinical way, to do with human psychology and happiness and so on, whereas at other times they write about him in a more speculative or spiritual way. So depending on what you're looking for, it'd be good to pick up a book that chimes with that. And you know, there's quite a lot of talks, there's YouTubes, as well as discussions like this, which are, you know, widely available. Perhaps Jung lived at a time when television had been born, and there's a famous, for example, interview with him. Again, now the name of the interviewer slips my mind right now, but if you Google Jung live or something like that, then some grainy black and white footage might come up before your eyes. So you can hear, the point is you can hear the man speak himself.
I think the interview is called Face to Face. I'm not sure.
That's exactly it. Yeah, that's the one. Yeah, Face to Face. Yeah, so yeah, go for that. It's very fascinating. Jung's great because towards the end of his life, he journeyed and explored all sorts of things, you know, that we haven't begun to touch on. But by the end of his life, because he lived to quite a good old age, he had that wisdom where he could say things quite simply and quite clearly, but with tremendous authority. So he is worth listening to. He became individuated, I think. You know, he became a very particular person, instantly recognizable, but somehow at the same time channeling so much more than just his individuality. So yeah, it's worth listening to him as well, and it's great that we can.
100%. Well, Mark, for anybody that wants to learn more about your work and your writing, etc., where can they find you online?
Yeah, thank you. So I have a website, markvernon.com. I post podcasts, YouTubes, on a variety of things, but often around inner life. I don't know, I'm doing a whole series on Dante's Divine Comedy at the minute. I have conversations with various people, like Rupert Sheldrake and other friends, and where we try and tease these things out. I write as well as practice as a psychotherapist. So I try and kind of bring it all together on that website, markvernon.com.
Great. Also, I would recommend for anybody looking for an introduction to Jung's key ideas, Mark actually wrote a series of articles for The Guardian. I think it was how long ago was that? Like 10
Yeah,
years?
a few years back now, yeah, but they've been gathered together. You can either buy the gathered together version on Amazon. It's called Jung, How to Believe, I think. But anyway, if you just Google Carl Jung and Mark Vernon, it should come up.
I was reading through them last night, really interesting stuff. So I highly recommend that there as well for anybody interested in these ideas. So Mark, thank you very much for taking the time. I really appreciate it. And yeah, I guess we'll speak soon. Okay.
Yeah, look, well, just let me say thank you for all you do, Niall, because you bring together a great forum that discusses all sorts of ideas, and it's tremendously helpful. So I appreciate what you do as well.